Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I am one of those guys who is fortunate to have had wonderful grandparents, but who is unfortunate to not have them in my life anymore. All four of my grandparents have passed away, and I miss them all. They were all spectacular. And one of the tough things about loss is that you feel it differently over time. There's, of course, that gaping wound that happens when you lose somebody you love, and it stings horribly in the moment. But then there's this numbing loss over time as you have less and less occasion to interact with things they set in motion, to interact with things that lost loved one touched or did or organized or arranged. And you realize that time has gone downriver and you're moving on chronologically from them. And you feel less of that proximity as their stuff and their fingerprints aren't around anymore. And I've felt that unfold with the loss of all four of my grandparents. But every now and then, I have these cool little moments of reconnection. And I had one of those this weekend. And I've been excited to get to a microphone and share this with you. So here's what happened. I've got this little red toolbox sitting in front of me here that belonged to my granddad Whitman. It's skinny, it's beat up. It looks like something from maybe the 50s or the 60s, and doesn't have a ton of tools in it. But, there's maybe 30 items in here. And so finally, I had the occasion after my parents handed this to me a couple of weeks ago. And like, hey, we had this in the garage. Haven't opened it. Thought you might want it. And I was like, yeah, I want it. So I took it. I worked on some stuff this weekend, and everything I needed for the job was in there. And at some point in the project, I came to a point where I needed a ratchet. And so I looked in here, and sure enough, there are two ratchets. I was like, oh, that's great. And then I looked a little closer, and they're both set up for a half-inch bolt or a half-inch nut. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. What were you up to, Granddad? And I looked a little bit closer, and sure enough, the one ratchet has a half-inch head on there, and it is set to go clockwise. And the other ratchet has a half-inch head on there, and it's set to go counterclockwise. I'm like, oh, look what you're doing. Like, you clearly had a nut and a bolt that were both half-inch, and you were using these to crank against each other. And so on the surface, it might look like, oh, my granddad was crazy. He was really losing it in his later years, eccentrically having two ratchets that do the exact same thing in the same toolbox. But you look a little bit closer, and you're like, no, he was a very sharp, very sane man. And there was clear method to what he was doing here. There was a reason for the redundancy because the two ratchets didn't really do the same thing. They were set up to work in a way that was complementary to each other. Thank you for listening to my story about my granddad. I appreciate that. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 13, we have two parables that feel like they're doing the same thing. You got the parable of the wheat and the weeds, which looks like it is a story about sorting. Lots of things get caught up in the same container. In this case, it's the field. Some of it's desirable, some of it's not. And ultimately, the person in charge of the field, given time, is going to sift out what makes sense and what doesn't. What is an object of beauty? What's going to be an object of judgment? Maybe that's troubling for you and me, but we're not God. So ultimately, we don't have to bear responsibility, and we can just defer to his wisdom and judgment. That's kind of part of the beauty of the parable. It really relieves pressure. And then in what, on the surface at least, looks like a redundancy, you get the parable of the net that we started talking about last time around. And just to refresh your memory, Matthew 13:47, the parable of the net goes like this. This is Jesus talking. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it'll be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Don't get too hung up on the fire and weeping and gnashing part. We're going to get to that and break it down in depth mañana. But for now, I want to consider more carefully why we have these two parables almost back to back. They're only separated by two little micro parables. Why we have these two parables almost back to back that seem like they're doing the same thing, like two identical tools in the same little toolbox. Well, the reason they seem like they're doing the same thing is because, again, they both involve sorting. They both involve a reckoning that happens at the end. But much like in my toolbox situation, I assumed the sanity of my granddad and thus looked a little more closely and realized, there's a touch of nuance between these two ratchets, and it makes sense that there would be two things here. So it is here. When we look a little closer, we see there's a dang good reason that we get two different things. First of all, in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, Jesus explicitly says the field is the world. But that is not explicit in the parable of the net. So is it possible that the parable of the net is talking more about the visible church, the people who, at least in word, claim to be followers of Jesus. It could be, if they're both talking about the world, and the field in the first parable means the world, and the big dragnet in the second one means the world, then maybe these two parables are a bit redundant. But the analogy doesn't quite fit both ways, does it? With the wheat and the weeds, okay, the field is the world, and there's some stuff in there that's good and redemptive, and there's some stuff in there that's chaotic and not so good. Yeah, that sounds like the world. And those two types of things arriving in that field are not the result of the master going out and trying to collect a whole bunch of indiscriminate things and then sorting it out. In that parable, the only thing the master put in the field was good seed, and the good stuff. Somebody else put the bad stuff in there. But in the second one, we're dragnet fishing. Other than chucking sticks of dynamite into the drink and seeing what floats up, this is about the most indiscriminate way you can fish. You're going to get all kinds of stuff in there. Any fish that is a low, medium, or high depth in the water is going to get caught up in a big, broad dragnet like this, and everything is just going to come to shore. So there's something a little more passive about the first parable, where the seed goes into the field and then we wait and it'll just go to plan, whereas there's something more active about the second parable. We're going to go out and get things actively out of this water, and the net is going to be so broad that we're going to get some stuff that is what we were looking for, and we're going to get some stuff that isn't exactly what we were looking for. So just by looking at the two competing images, it makes sense that Jesus would say the first one is a general description of how the world is going to work out. Kingdom stuff is going to grow up alongside not kingdom stuff. The field is going to look not tended, but it is tended, and the master is going to sort that stuff out. It's beautiful. This is depressurizing for the kingdom citizen. There's an ethic of patience from God that is imitated by the kingdom citizen in that scenario. Is beautiful. But in a way, the second one has two reckonings, two harvests. One is a more general collecting of everything. Hey, this is open. Come on in. And then later, there's a more selective examination of what ended up in that net. Is it possible, then, that the reason these two parables are here is because the second one is a narrower view than the first one, that the parable of the net is saying, okay, now let's zoom in from the big picture of the world and down to stuff that is church-ish or vaguely like the church, people who vaguely, to very seriously, claim to be kingdom citizens. And maybe y'all are going to be looking around at how the kingdom unfolds, and you're like, there's some weird stuff in church. I don't know if that fits. I don't know if that's what you were describing. I don't know if that's evocative of kingdom values or not. And then Jesus, through the parable, anticipating that this is how things are going to unfold, is saying, yep, the kingdom is going to be a pretty broad net, and there's going to be some stuff in there that makes a lot of sense. In this moment of history that is the upcoming age of the church, there might be some stuff that happens under the banner of the kingdom, that happens within the walls of the kingdom that's pretty shifty, and that is going to be hauled to shore eventually and sifted through. Well, if that is the meaning, I find that to be very encouraging, because I don't know if you've heard about the last 2,000 years of history, but for all the beautiful things that Christianity has been a part of during that time, we've also got some pretty ugly black eyes during that time. We've done stuff that doesn't make any sense in terms of world kingdom values, but that it's been reflective of kingdom values, and it's wildly redemptive and helpful and transformative in society in all kinds of good ways. Like, all the good reforms that have happened have had some kind of theology of the kingdom behind them. Go look it up. But there's also been a whole bunch of stuff that's exactly the opposite of kingdom values. Violent stuff, infighting, exhuming a corpse and putting it on trial a second time to make some kind of weird political point in the Middle Ages about popes and who ought to be in charge. You got the witch trial stuff. You got elements of the Crusades. You got elements of slavery, where some people, in weird ways, tried to use the Bible to make that all work and justify it. Ultimately, I'm not going to pin all of that on Christianity, because Christians were also the ones who made it go away. Good for the goose, good for the gander. You got to give fair credit in both directions. But the point is, even a cursory look at history tells us that this has been a bit of an up and down proposition. And remember, all of these kingdom parables are reframing expectations. So it looks to me like the wheat and the weeds is reframing an expectation of what the relationship between kingdom people and not kingdom people is going to be like. It's modeling an ethic of how to think about people who reject the kingdom, yet grow up right alongside kingdom people, doing life, making money, having family, getting by. How is that going to be resolved or reconciled? Is it the job of the kingdom citizen to sort all that out and to bring the bad people to heel. No, it's not. Here's how the kingdom is going to play out. Be patient like the master. Cool. The second thing we get here looks more like it is saying, and also, here's another way the kingdom is going to play out. It's not always going to be pretty. It should be, but as God is in this phase of enormous patience, sin and corruption are going to be a part of the physical manifestation of the kingdom in the world, and some gross stuff is going to happen under the banner of that kingdom. And again, here we get an ethic or a warning or even a reassurance that that will be addressed. Much like the field that might seem untended, so that net might seem indiscriminate and untended as well, but it's actually going to be very carefully tended with the one being who is capable of making the judgments as to which basket the things that came out of the dragnet go into. That being will ultimately make those judgments, which again is depressurizing because it allows the kingdom citizen to look at stuff that is maybe beyond their control but is happening under the banner of the kingdom, to do their part in trying to make that better, but also to say, I don't need to hit the all-time eternal panic button. Jesus himself, the guy for whom the religion was named, said there was going to be weird crap that got done in his name. And it turns out that, once again, Jesus knows exactly what he's talking about. So in the same way that I go into my grandfather's toolbox and I see what looks like a redundancy in tools until I look a little bit closer and figure out that there is an absolutely intentional, though subtle reason that both of those ratchets were set up the way they were. So we get to Matthew 13. We see two parables that look like they're doing the same thing, but a closer look tells us that it's addressing two natural questions that people were going to have as they started to observe how this kingdom unfolds over time. I sounded oddly certain and self-important down the home stretch there. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe it's just the sheer power of holding this ratchet in my hand that makes me feel like I can just get after it. Gigantic high five, listen for it, to everybody who has signed up to support the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. You rule and you make this thing go, and I really, really hyper ridiculously appreciate you. And I've enjoyed corresponding with you over the last few days as a whole lot of you have bounced notes back and forth with me, which is really cool. Thanks for taking the time to do that. All right, we're wrapping it up there. We're going to talk about the weeping and gnashing of teeth stuff mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.